Watching this, maybe you've had a moment where someone you love says something so wrong that everything goes quiet. Not the kind of quiet that's peaceful, the kind that means something just broke and you're the only one who heard it. Subscribe if you want to hear what I did about it. My name is Carter, and this is the story of how my own brother decided I owed him my life. My brother Miles and I grew up sharing a bedroom in a 2-story house in Columbus, Ohio. Bunk beds. His baseball posters on his side, my books stacked on mine. Our parents worked hard. My dad drove a delivery truck for 22 years. My mom did bookkeeping for a dental practice. We weren't rich, but we were steady. That's the word I'd use. Steady. And for a long time, so were Miles and me. He's 4 years older than me. When I was 10, he taught me how to ride a bike without training wheels by just pushing me down a small hill and saying, "Pedal, dummy." It worked. I skinned my knee, but it worked. That's Miles in a sentence, honestly. Rough method, real result. Zero apology. I thought that was just personality. I didn't understand yet that some people mistake impatience for strength. I did well in school. Miles did okay. He was better with his hands. Could fix anything mechanical. Had a feel for engines that I genuinely envied. He started working at an auto shop out of high school and eventually became a lead technician. Good money. He bought a truck. He met a woman named Dana and they got engaged. From the outside, Miles had his life together. I went to college on a combination of scholarship and loans. Computer science. I lived cheap, ramen, shared apartments, the whole thing. My parents couldn't contribute much, and I never asked them to. I figured that was my responsibility. When I graduated, I got hired at a mid-sized tech company in Cincinnati. Not Silicon Valley. Just solid, normal work. Writing back-end code, fixing bugs, sitting through meetings. I was 23 and I was making more money than I knew what to do with. Which sounds like a good problem, but it wasn't what I thought it would feel like. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment and started saving. The plan was simple. Buy a house before 30. That was it. That was the whole plan. Miles called me the night I signed the lease on my apartment. He said, "You think you're better than us now?" I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. That silence again. I said, "Miles, I just moved to a new city for work." He said, "Yeah, I know what you did." Then he changed the subject to the Bengals and I led him because I didn't know what else to do with what he'd just said. For about 2 years, everything was surface level fine between us. Holiday dinners, the occasional text, birthday calls that lasted 4 minutes. My parents would mention him and I'd say, "Sounds good," and mean it. I wasn't keeping score. There was nothing to keep score of. Then Dana left him. I don't know all the details, and I'm not going to pretend I do. What I know is that Miles called me on a Tuesday night, and he was crying in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids. Something about the way a person cries when they really don't want to be crying. Fighting it while it's happening. He said she'd moved out, said she'd been unhappy for a long time, and he hadn't seen it. His voice sounded like it was coming from a long way away. I drove to Columbus that weekend. Sat with him in his apartment, which was already starting to smell like a place where a person had stopped taking care of themselves. Empty pizza boxes. Sports on TV he wasn't really watching. I stayed for 2 days, and when I left, I told him to call me anytime. He did call. A lot. At first that was fine. I was glad he was talking instead of going silent. But over the next few months, the calls started shifting. Less, "I'm struggling," and more, "I need." He needed help with his electric bill because the separation had wrecked his budget. He needed to borrow money for a lawyer because Dana wanted a formal separation agreement even though they hadn't been married. He needed $500 for a part for his truck. I helped every time. Not because I felt obligated. I want to be clear about that. I helped because he was my brother and he was in a bad place and I had money and he didn't. The part I didn't see coming was when he asked to move in. It was March. I had just put an offer on a house, a 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood outside Cincinnati, good yard, a garage I planned to use as a home office. The offer was accepted. I was 2 weeks away from closing. I mentioned it to Miles on the phone because I was excited. He said, "So you'll have a spare room?" I said, "Yeah, eventually. I'm going to set one up as an office." He said, "I need somewhere to land, Carter. I can't keep paying this apartment rent on what I'm making right now. Just let me stay with you for a few months while I get back on my feet." I want to be honest, I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to help. but because something in me knew that a few months is a phrase that means something different depending on who's saying it. But he was my brother. I said yes. He moved in 6 weeks after I closed on the house. The first month was genuinely fine. He paid a small amount toward utilities. His idea, which I respected. He cooked a few times a week, which I appreciated. He was gone most of the day at work. We'd watch TV at night and it felt occasionally like being kids again in that way that's both comforting and slightly wrong for grown adults. The second month, things started to drift. He stopped contributing to utilities. When I brought it up, he said he'd had an unexpected expense and he'd catch it next month. Okay. Next month came and he didn't bring it up. And when I mentioned it, he looked at me like I'd said something unkind. I'm your brother, Carter. Not a sentence with a point. Just that. Just the relationship offered as explanation. He started bringing Dana over. Wait, not Dana. They were separated. He'd started seeing someone new. Her name was Gwen. She was over 3 or 4 nights a week. Fine. I wasn't going to police his social life. But then, she started staying over. Then she started leaving her things in the bathroom. Then one evening, I came home from work and Gwen was in my kitchen making dinner like she lived there. And Miles was watching the game. And neither of them looked up when I walked in. I said, "Hey," Miles said. "Hey, grab a plate." I stood there for a second, grabbed a plate. I started keeping a document on my laptop, not to be calculating, or maybe a little to be calculating, I won't lie. I wrote down every utility bill, every grocery run I made that Miles ate from, every month. The informal agreement slipped without acknowledgement. I didn't know what I was going to do with the document. I just needed to see it written down. By month 5, Miles had not paid $1 toward anything in 3 months. Gwen was there nearly every night. I'd started feeling like a guest in my own house, which is such a cliched way to describe it that I almost didn't write it. Except that's the only way to say it because it's exactly what it was. I tried to have a direct conversation with Miles about the arrangement, sat down with him on a Sunday afternoon. No Gwen there, just the 2 of us. I said I loved having him here, but we needed to revisit the financial agreement. I'd be happy to set a modest rent well below market, just enough to acknowledge that we had an agreement. Miles looked at me for a long moment. He said, "You know what your problem is? You've always thought money made you better than the rest of us." I said, "Miles, I'm not asking you for much. I'm asking you to contribute something." He said, "You have a great job. You have this house. You don't need my money." That's not what this is about. Then what is it about? I didn't have an answer that he was going to accept, because the answer, it's about respect. It's about the fact that you act like this is your house, and it isn't, was a sentence that would have started something I wasn't ready to finish. So I let it go. I shouldn't have. I know that now. Things stayed tense for a couple of weeks and then went back to normal surface, the way things do when both people have decided to pretend a conversation didn't happen. And then came the dinner. My parents drove down from Columbus in October. My mom wanted to see the house. She hadn't visited yet and kept saying she felt bad about that. My dad came because my mom was driving and he doesn't like to let her drive long distances alone, which is one of his quiet ways of taking care of her that I've always found kind. We had dinner at my kitchen table. My mom made her pot roast. Miles grilled something outside. Gwen was there. It was actually a decent evening for about an hour and a half. Then my dad asked Miles what his plan was. Miles said he was saving up. My dad said, "Carter's been patient. You've got to give him something." Miles put his fork down. He said, "Carter doesn't need it." My dad said, "That's not really the point." And then Miles said it. He said it to my dad, across the table, while my mom and Gwen were right there, while I was sitting 3 feet away. He said, "Carter acts like he's doing everyone a favor by existing. He's always needed people to tell him he's doing a good job. His whole life. He's not generous. He's just buying approval." The table went quiet. My mom said, "Miles," said, "It's true. He lets me live here so he can feel like the good one. He always needed to be the good one, even when we were kids." I didn't say anything. I looked down at my plate. My dad said, "Son, that's not fair." But his voice was careful in the way that meant he was managing a situation, not actually disagreeing. And that was what broke something in me. Not what Miles said. Exactly. What broke it was looking around the table and realizing my parents were going to let it go. They were going to smooth it over the way they had smoothed things over my entire life. Because Miles was difficult and difficult people got managed and quiet people got assumed to be fine, my mom changed the subject to a neighbor back home. My dad followed her lead. Gwen looked at her phone. Miles picked up his fork. And I sat there and made a decision so quietly that no one at the table noticed. The next morning, I called a lawyer, not to sue anyone, just to understand my rights as a homeowner in Ohio with an informal tenant who had not signed any lease. The lawyer was a woman named, I'm going to call her Ms. P. She asked me not to use her name, who explained the process calmly and without drama. She said because there was no signed lease, Miles was technically a month-to-month tenant. She said I could issue a written 30-day notice to vacate. She said she could prepare the documentation if I wanted to proceed. I said I needed to think about it. I thought about it for 11 days. During those 11 days, I watched Miles come home from work and sit on my couch and watch my TV and eat my groceries. And I watched Gwen settle in for the evening most nights. And I watched my house continue to be a place I was surviving in rather than living in. I also called my college roommate, a guy named Brennan who'd known me for years and who I trusted to be honest with me. I told him everything, the dinner, the comment, the whole arc. He listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it sounds. When I finished, he said, Carter, you know what you have to do. I said I didn't want to blow up my family. He said, it sounds like it already went off. You just didn't throw the match. On day 12, I called Ms. P back and told her to prepare the notice. I also did something else. Quietly, over the course of the next week, I gathered every record I had. Every utility bill. Every grocery receipt I'd saved in that document I'd started keeping months ago. Every Venmo transfer I'd made to Miles for his expenses since the day Dana left. I tallied it. The number was more than I expected. More than he expected too, I'm sure. Because he'd never thought of it as a number. He'd thought of it as family. I want to say clearly, I am not someone who moves through the world keeping score. That is not who I am. But there is a difference between not keeping score and allowing someone to rewrite the rules mid-game and then tell you you're the problem. I gave Miles a 30-day notice on a Thursday evening. I waited until Gwen wasn't there. I printed 2 copies, one for him, one for me. And I sat down at the kitchen table where we'd had that dinner and I slid 1 copy across to him. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. He said, "What is this?" I said, "It's a formal notice. You have 30 days to find other housing." He said, "You're kidding me." "I'm not." He looked up. "I'm your brother." I said, "I know." There was a long pause and then he said what I think he'd been holding on to since that dinner, maybe longer. He said, "I knew you'd do this eventually. You were just waiting for an excuse to play the victim. That's what you do. You help people just enough to be able to hold it over them." I let him finish. Then I said, "I've been keeping records since July. Every bill, every expense, everything I paid and everything you didn't. I'm not going to ask you to pay it back. I'm not going to tell Mom and Dad what the total is. All I'm asking is that you move out within 30 days and we go back to being brothers who don't live together because I think we're better at that." He stared at me. He said, "You kept records." I said, "I needed to see it clearly." Another long silence. He picked up the notice. He read it with that expression. He set it down. He said, "Fine." He got up and went to his room. I sat at the table for a while. The house was very quiet. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something and then stopped. I got up and washed the 2 coffee mugs that were sitting in the sink and put them away. Miles was gone in 26 days. He didn't say much during those weeks. A few logistical things, when he'd be picking up his last boxes, whether I wanted him to leave the key on the counter or hand it to me. I said counter was fine. The morning he left, he carried his last bag out to his truck and then stood in the doorway for a second. I was standing in the kitchen. We looked at each other across the length of the house. He said, "I'll pay you back." I said, "You don't have to." He said, "You don't have to." He said, "I know I don't have to." He left the key on the counter. I heard his truck pull out of the driveway. I didn't go to the window. I called my mom that evening. She'd known about the notice. Miles had told her. She was quiet for a moment and then she said she understood. She sounded sad. I said I was sad too. And that was the truest thing I'd said out loud in months. She asked if Miles and I would be okay. I said I thought so. Eventually, that was 8 months ago, Miles got an apartment with a buddy from the shop. He texted me happy birthday in February. I texted back, "We're not close right now, and I don't know when we will be." Maybe that's its own kind of answer. What I know is this: I walk through my house now and it's mine. Not in a triumphant way. Not in the way I thought it would feel when I first put in the offer. Just mine in the quiet way. That means when I come home from work and drop my keys on the counter, the house is the way I left it. There's no one on my couch who makes me feel like an inconvenience in my own living room. There's no weight sitting in the corner of every room that I was pretending not to feel. I didn't do this to win. I didn't do it to be the good one, whatever Miles thinks that means. I did it because at some point you have to decide that being related to someone doesn't mean being diminished by them. You can love someone and still say, "Not like this. Not in my house." If that landed with you, if you've been sitting with something that feels like this, I'd be glad if you subscribed. There are more stories here. They're all true. Thanks for being with me. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that house. Not the logistics, the notice, the records, the 30 days. I mean, what happened underneath all of it. Why it took as long as it did. Why I kept absorbing things I shouldn't have absorbed. The honest answer is that I confused loyalty with tolerance. I thought being a good brother meant not making things difficult. And Miles, without ever deciding to, I think, learned that I would keep choosing smooth over true. Every time I let a bill slide without saying anything, every time I changed the subject instead of finishing the conversation. I was teaching him without meaning to that there were no real consequences to how he treated me. That's not his fault entirely. That's on me too. What I've come to understand is that the way things end up between people isn't usually the result of one big moment. It's the result of 100 small choices, repeated. Miles didn't become someone who could sit at my table and say I was just helping him to feel superior overnight. That version of him was built slowly, over months, out of a dynamic I participated in. I kept giving without requiring anything to be true between us. Not honesty, not acknowledgement, not basic fairness. And when nothing is required, people stop offering it. The dinner didn't break something. It revealed something that had already been broken for a while. What I kept asking myself after Miles left was whether I'd done the right thing. Not legally, not logically. Actually right. And I kept coming back to the same place. There's nothing kind about letting a situation continue that is hurting both people. I was getting smaller in my own home. Miles was getting away with something that was making him someone I didn't recognize. Neither of us was being served by me staying quiet. Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's printing 2 copies of a document and sitting down at a kitchen table and sliding one across without raising your voice. That took more out of me than any argument would have, because it meant I'd made a real decision, not a reaction, a decision, and I had to live with it regardless of how anyone responded. I think about Brennan telling me the thing had already gone off. I just hadn't thrown the match. He was right, and there's something clarifying about that. When you stop telling yourself you're preserving the peace and admit the peace is already gone, you get to stop managing and start being honest. Miles said he'd pay me back. I told him he didn't have to. I meant it. What I needed wasn't the money. What I needed was my house back. Not just the rooms, but the feeling of being in a place that was mine. That feeling returned almost immediately after he left, and it wasn't triumphant. It was just quiet. Real quiet. The kind you can actually rest in. I don't know exactly where Miles and I go from here. I hope somewhere good. What I know is that the relationship we had inside that house wasn't one I want back. Maybe rebuild something different, something more honest. That would be worth having.